This is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you for joining us this week. This week brings us another interview, this time with a dear friend of mine. Kelsey Gordon is a master's candidate in history at Ball State University, studying mid-century American popular culture. She is still a closeted atheist, but is slowly working on coming out to friends and family. She also volunteers as an admin for a mental illness support page and serves as a staff editor for the newly created Burkhart Journal. We had a great conversation about atheism, politics, history, and pop culture. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Kelsey Gordon. Kelsey Gordon, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
I am just fine. I am really looking forward to our conversation.
Me too.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. And it's going to be a real blast. So just as a quick aside, you and I have been friends for a while, and we're both sort of in the same field of history. And we'll, a little bit. And we'll be having a pretty history-heavy conversation tonight, which I'm very excited about. I've had another one before with a guest by the name of Luciano Gonzalez, so I'm looking forward to having another sort of history conversation. So,
I did listen to that one actually. So
oh, cool!
Really good.
Thank you. I think we had a very, engaging and informative discussion about monuments and how we deal with issues of the Confederacy and how they relate to white supremacy and things like that. So I was pretty happy with that conversation. But that was Luciano. We're talking about you. So tell me a little bit about your background, what your upbringing was like. Was your upbringing religious? Was it not religious? And kind of where are you now? And where are you now?
So for starters, growing up, it's always complicated me telling my backstory because I kind of had a little bit more of an opposite than what most people go through. Growing up, I was raised in a very secular household. My dad comes from a Southern Baptist family, and he kind of saw the negative impacts of religion as far as basically my family disowning my aunt because she's bisexual. So he wanted to keep my sister and I out of church, not necessarily because he saw it as like this evil thing or whatever, but like because he wanted us to make our own decisions growing up. And so I pretty much grew up understanding that religion was something that you got to choose and you weren't just forced upon. However, the older I got, the more my dad and his family started having that impact on me of whether I started being nailed with the idea that you weren't a good person unless you went to church, and only God-fearing people were good people and moral in society. And that really kind of came to a head when I was in my early teens, and I chose to be baptized as an Episcopal, actually, rather than a Southern Baptist. And when I started tailoring off from that, my dad, pushed and was like, how are you going to get to heaven if you don't go to church? Or how are you going to show that you're a good person if you don't keep going with church? And that was a real struggle growing up, along with just kind of the implications that my family kind of put on my sister and I, where, it was important that we paid respects in the church. And while I find, respecting religion important in general, theirs was just a whole nother level of hatred and just blatant disrespect for family members who didn't go to church or who didn't believe the way they believed. Or, I grew up in a family where a lot of people don't do some very good things, and I'm not going to go into detail with that, but them doing those horrible things, what society in general would deem horrible, was still okay because they went to church. But because my sister and I didn't, we were pretty much ostracized from the family, and neither my sister and I really have a good relationship with many people on my dad's side of the family because of that. And pretty much when I turned 20, so this was about 3 years ago, I really started questioning a lot. And I was going through a difficult point in my life, and things were really dark and things were really scary for me. And I finally broke down and started really asking questions about what I believed and why I was feeling this way, and doing research and trying to understand things outside of this small little sphere that was my life. And this was about the time when I met, the mutual friends that you and I have together, who really sat down and talked to me and really just kind of showed me a world outside of what I grew up in. And because of them, I really started questioning my belief.
So let's unpack that a minute. So let's unpack that a bit. Okay. So when you say it sort of questioned your beliefs, what were some of the things that you were exposed to, and how did they inform the questions that you began to ask, and what kind of questions were you asking?
Well, for starters, a lot of it goes, like I said, meeting those mutual friends of ours really helped to kind of broaden my horizons, where growing up, I was always told that if you weren't a believer, then you were automatically the stereotypical set the world on fire, kill babies, rape women kind of person. Straight out of the quote unquote atheist Bible that we somehow possess. And it really meeting those people and realizing just how genuinely good people they were. And how nice and caring, it really made me stop and think that just because they didn't believe didn't mean that they weren't good people. And that really is what set the stage for me questioning of whether there's a heaven, whether there's a hell, if it's worth, being this particular type of person instead of the other because you'll get into heaven. Is there only one good way to be a good person? And I think that the humanist side of being a secular humanist really is what drove me away. Just realizing that I could still be a good person and still question and ask questions and get answers rather than just because God said so, or because Jesus said so, or because that's what the church believes. And just really asking questions on whether religion really impacted who we are as people, rather than the religion just being a product of us.
That's interesting. So that reminds me very much of a chapter in Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, about the idea of, the chapter is called Religion is a Team Sport. And it's about this idea that a common notion within sort of the atheist literature, whether it's Dawkins or Harris or Hitchens or others, is that religion is sort of a virus that sort of latches on to humanity and warps it for its purposes. Haidt has a different interpretation. He thinks that religion was sort of a group level adaptation. It was something that grew out of group level selection and evolution, which is controversial in and of itself.
Right.
There's a very lively debate within biology about the extent to which group selection is possible, because primarily the primary engine of natural selection is individuals or individual organisms, and then within mammals or primates like us, individual people or individual animals. And his argument is essentially that religion was a group level orientated adaptation that allowed for societies to then organize and systematize. And then from there, they would take over the centuries as humans evolved into the more complex civilizations that would come later, that religion sort of branched off and became different things. And that's where you get science, that's where you get philosophy, that's where you get all these other things.
Right.
I'm fairly sympathetic to that position because it makes a lot more sense than seeing it as a virus. One of the problems with seeing religion as a virus is it gives it a certain level of agency that I don't think it has. I don't think religion has that much agency on its own. I actually don't think it has too much agency among individual people. Where I think it has a tremendous amount of agency is in groups, and in the collective nature of things. So that's kind of where, that's kind of my interesting. So I very much agree with you in the sense that those changes that happened over time were much more a natural product of being human than they were something else.
Right. I mean, you look, speaking historically, and because I kind of agree with that statement in itself, is right now I'm taking a Russian history course. And if you look at Russian civilizations and how they used religion, and it wasn't necessarily, you know, a lot of modern Christians are like, oh, well, this was given to me by God, this faith was given to me, you know, by the Spirit. But if you look at early modern civilizations and like the clan, even going back to like the clan atmosphere of groups of people, they chose religions based on what best suited them rather than just what they actually believe, but what carried their message as a civilization. Those in Rus and those in Poland, the leaders of Rus chose Orthodox Christianity because it best suited how they wanted to live their lives. The kings wanted to live their lives. And it wasn't necessarily a method that was just that suited their spirituality, but rather how they wanted their civilization run.
And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, one of the things about the emergence of this schism that existed between once the Roman Empire breaks up in the third or fourth century. Once it breaks, something like that. I think it's the third century. Once it breaks up, you have these factions, right? And so the west of Europe goes to what is originally, the Goths, and then eventually goes to the Gauls, and then eventually it becomes what we know as modern Europe, which is then sort of, once Christianity becomes a force, becomes Catholicism. On the other side of that, you had the Byzantine Empire, which was stationed in Turkey, and that section of it went Eastern Orthodox. And it has stayed traditionally Eastern Orthodox, with the exception of Turkey, which is now a majority Muslim country.
Right.
And so those schisms have an incredible amount of power. I was listening to a podcast earlier today about how incredibly important the Catholic Church was as an institution for the solidarity movement of Poland in the 1980s in combating anti-communism, because it was a way of binding people together and uniting them under a common goal and a common thread that they could then use. I think that's really where religion is at its most interesting. I think for me, as an atheist, the beliefs themselves don't mean all that much. Most of them are nonsense, and we can just discard with that. The thing I'm very interested in is the way in which religion socially organizes people and motivates them to do different things. And if we can understand that, then we can try to build secular alternatives that do all of the same things that religion has traditionally done in that context, but without all of the baggage of supernaturalism.
Well, if you look historically through movements, and you see it back in medieval times and even modern with, you saw it in World War II, you saw it in the Cold War, which is the era I study. You see it now where religion is pretty much the top of the stage for the whole argument of them versus us. We're the good people because we believe this. They're the bad people because they believe that. And, I shared with you that website the other day where you saw those rises in belief in Christianity around the early 50s, around the late 40s, early 60s, right before, the free love movement and, the rise in secularism there.
Mm-hmm.
And you see it now after September 11th and here with all these modern terrorist attacks that are coming about, where they want to separate themselves from this evil other. Whether it was in the 50s, the communistic atheist other, or the Muslim terrorist atheist, or not atheist other, but the Muslim terrorist other. And the only other alternative to show, oh, we're good people, we're different, is, well, we're Christians.
And that's a very modern notion because, and I've mentioned, I think this to you and to people before, is that the idea of the person describing themselves as quote unquote Christian in the American context is very modern.
Oh, very.
Most people, if you asked them a century ago what they were religiously, they would say, I'm Catholic, or I'm Methodist, or I'm Baptist, or I'm Presbyterian, Unitarian, Protestant, Lutheran. They would be very specific. The reason that the term Christian became more in vogue is it's more, in my opinion, when people say that they're Christians, that's more of a political statement than it actually is a religious statement, because the reason that the term Christian became so much in vogue was the reaction to the social and political upheavals of the 1960s. And so when you had the beginnings of the free love movement, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the emergence of being against the war, against Vietnam, and then that leads into the sort of alternative spirituality of the 1960s and 1970s. And you see the emergence of transcendental meditation, you see the emergence of Kabbalah, and then eventually it all sort of becomes the New Age movement. And Christians, I think rightfully so, well, not rightfully so, but rightfully understood that in order for them to have any kind of political power and any kind of influence on their government, they were better together than they were separate. And so Catholics and Protestants, or Lutherans and Baptists and all their different divisions, they put all of those aside to achieve a goal, which was to instill its own version of sort of Christian patriotism. Because I think that another component to those social trends you were talking about earlier, which I think the stuff you share with me was from Gallup.
Yeah, Gallup.
Is this thing where anytime that you see those surges of religiosity, they do often coincide with a tragedy, but they do also coincide with a moment of an intense need for patriotism.
Right.
Excuse me. So you see an intense religious fervor near World War I. You see another one near World War II. You see another one in the Cold War. You see another one in the 1980s with the rise of the evangelicals, and you see another one after 9/11. It's not any surprise, because in this country, there is sort of a civil Christianity that blends or melds the concepts of God and country as one thing. And so to be a Christian is to be a patriotic citizen. And that is a very, very potent force.
Well, I actually, part of my research, I've been looking at like the old industrial videos that were kind of released by the government as this like propaganda in a way. I'm sure you've heard of Bert the Turtle and all them fun little characters. And I was actually watching one earlier today where he was talking about, it was a actor playing a general in the army, and was talking about citizenship and how to be a proper civilian in America. And, he emphasized, this isn't, it's the Cold War. This isn't, fought on the ground with men in boots. It's fought at homes. And over and over and over again, he stated that, good Christians will win this war. Good Christians will, prevail. And, you need to show patriotism through Christianity. And just that notion of, rather than coming together as a solidified country of people from different origins and different backgrounds, like we've always claimed we were, there's this surge, this actor saying, no, the only way to defeat this is through Christianity and through God. And aside from being just a gold mine of a source for my point that I want to make with this whole project I'm doing right now, it just really helped me focus and centralize my ideas on the decade of the 50s and how we changed our mind with Christianity and all that.
Definitely. So let's start unpacking that. So you do research. You are a master's candidate in history at Ball State.
I am.
And you are doing research on the 1950s, and some of the 60s. Is it just sort of broadly the mid-century point, or?
Broadly the mid-century point. I kind of open it up to about 45 to 65.
Okay.
So pretty much right after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and right before the free love movement and
Right on.
the civil rights movements. Basically, that decade or two, I guess 20 years, that we as historians kind of term as the atomic age.
Mm-hmm. There's an excellent book by an historian by the name of H.W. Brands that covers this period very well, and it's called The Strange Death of Liberalism, or The Strange Death of American Liberalism. And he talks about how that period of the 1940s to the 1960s, if you look at polling data, public polling data, Americans had an incredible amount of confidence in their government, in their government to do well, in their government to do the right thing, to manage the economy, to manage society. They had a tremendous amount of confidence in their leaders and in their institutions. I don't think that's any surprise. If you look at, to me, all of this really starts with the Depression and how the Great Depression was a moment where the government of the United States, led by Franklin Roosevelt, and the policies that would eventually become known as the New Deal, solidified an American liberalism that changed it away from the sort of classical liberal notion of the 19th century, which is about sort of free minds and free markets, which we today pretty much call libertarianism or classical liberalism, into modern, what I would call managerial liberalism or modern progressivism, which is about the idea that the government can be sort of a steady hand at the ship of state, a steady hand at the ship of society, and making sure that extremes are sort of alleviated by the need of a strong central government to handle them. And so this is a period where you see immense amounts of experimentation and innovation within government. And this is across all levels of government, both in the national security state, the courts, and in the presidency. You see a huge expansion of powers in the presidency.
Right.
And so this whole period is fascinating because the peak of that confidence, the American confidence in our system, really is 1965, is with the Voting Rights Act. After the Voting Rights Act, you see America's long, as you well know, you see America's long descent into Vietnam. And once we get into that, and then we get into the emergence of what's commonly known as the New Left, which sort of replaces the FDR left, that eventually leads people away. And I know a lot of people blame Watergate for people's distrust of government, and that's a part of it, but it really began with Vietnam.
It definitely really began with Vietnam, and it began with this kind of facade that the government had during the 50s and during the 60s. You know, America, the beautiful, we just came out of this awesome war. And a lot of people were just generally riding on that facade and riding on that great wave of, you know, America is unstoppable. And then all of a sudden we hit Vietnam and we're sitting here thinking, well, shit, we are stoppable. Maybe not in so much of a way as like, I mean, it was Vietnam and guerrilla warfare and all that, but, you know, it was this abrupt end to this feeling of immortality that America had during this time.
So one thing that Brands brings up in this book, because I think it's a prescient point, and I know other scholars have made this point as well. I recently read a book this year called The Fractured Republic, which is by a scholar from the American Enterprise Institute named Yuval Levin. He's a conservative, but I do think his points are very valid about some of the nature of American politics and how things have changed. And the point that they both make is that that period that you do research on, the 1940s and 1960s, you will see in our political discourse a nostalgia for those periods. On the political left, you see the nostalgia for sort of the Great Society, the Lyndon Johnson period, the social programs, the social welfare, the civil rights movement. On the right, you see a nostalgia for the sort of social conservatism of the period. You know, the wife, two kids, picket fence, dog, the very strict social values, the value of religion, those kinds of things. So you can, and we really have seen political candidates on both sides use these pillars. But the point that Levin and Brands make is that period is an anomaly in American history, because the amount of social cohesion that happened in that period was unlike any other period in American history. For most of our history, our country has been incredibly diverse, incredibly fractured, and incredibly, for lack of a better word, there's been vast amounts of both political as well as economic inequality. Those have just been the norm. That period was not the norm, but yet somehow it's treated as the norm in our modern political discourse. Do you think there's a reason for that?
I think it just goes back to, aside from, like you said, there's good, each side, conservatives, liberals, pretty much however you fit on the political spectrum of, American politics, you can find something in that 20-year span that, yes, this is what our party is all about. This is what our platform is all about. And that 20 years, like I said, regardless of where you stand on the spectrum, you can find something.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do also believe it kind of is a part of this facade of the glorious 50s and the rise of Camelot, as you hear with JFK, and just how we over-exaggerate how beautiful everything was in the 50s.
For certain. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the movie Back to the Future. I love Back to the Future. Mm-hmm. And if you think of the way that 1955 Hill Valley is portrayed, it is this caricature. It's this very strange, hyperbolic caricature of what the 50s were, especially in regards to race. So if you look at Back to the Future, there's only a handful of African Americans in that period, in that town. One is a kid who works at the diner. His name's Goldie Wilson, and Marty McFly, when he goes back to 1955, he knows who Goldie Wilson becomes. Goldie Wilson becomes the mayor of Hill Valley by the 1980s, and a very successful and beloved mayor at that. But in the 1950s, he's just working as like a busboy at this diner or whatever. And so chumming around with the owner, and the owner's just like, oh, a colored, you're a colored boy, you're not going to amount to much or whatever. And this kid says, ooh, look here, Mr. Carruthers, I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to be somebody someday. And Marty McFly goes, yeah, you're going to be the mayor. And he's like, a mayor? Yeah, I could be the mayor. And then he becomes the mayor. And the only other African-American characters you see in the film are the band that come in that play at the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, mm-hmm. where you get the Chuck Berry joke. Other than that, it's all white people. And the thing about the film is that's a strong comment on the period, because we have this notion that the 1950s were this amazing, glorious time where inequality dramatically decreased, more Americans had more prosperity than at any time in its history, which was true.
Yes. And I mean, science has a lot to do with that, because I mean, a lot of our home products are byproducts in a way of the nuclear bomb and the atomic bomb. I mean, mm-hmm. we wouldn't have microwaves if it wasn't for some dude in a lab saying, hey, let's melt stuff with this machine.
Exactly. And you had the emergence of a permanent consumer class who could constantly have consumer durables. And that really changed everything, because there was an amount of people for the first time in American history who could really gain a certain level of material wealth that they couldn't have before. But the paradox of that is the way in which the 1950s were really a problem. So one of the things that tends to get under-discussed in the nature of the 1950s, and part of it is the nature of how the statistics are, and you might be able to speak to this a little better than me, but there is really some serious social problems. You have domestic violence. You have social delinquency, which of course becomes, the juvenile delinquent thing. And then of course, I think the elephant in the room, which is Jim Crow, and the discrimination against African Americans, and the disgusting treatment of our society in the way that African Americans were treated as second-class citizens, We're not allowed to the front of the bus. We're not allowed at the lunch counter. We're not allowed in the schools. This starts to change in that period. And and a lot of it has to do with the fact that you had people who were both forward-thinking, people like Earl Warren and Thurgood Marshall, and you had others who were pragmatic, and like Dwight Eisenhower, who wasn't himself like the biggest gung-ho supporter of civil rights, but understood the nature of why it was important to send in the National Guard to protect the Little Rock Nine.
Oh, yeah.
So that period has so many contradictions, and it's not as sort of wholesome as we tend to think it is.
Honestly, I'm one of those people that I am a big contradiction when it comes to the 50s because, you know, I love the aesthetic of the 50s. I love, you know, the modern or the mid-century family with the wife at home and the children and the white picket fence life and the glitz and glam and Camelot about it.
Mm-hmm.
I love saying Camelot. But at the same time, in January, I was marching in Indy with the Women's March. My sister went to D.C. to march in D.C. And if you look at, I laughed at it when you said, you know, the domestic violence, only because, obviously not because it's a laughing matter, but because it is one of those events that is so shadowed and so covered up when you look at the 50s. You know, it was actually still legal in many states of this country until 75 for a man to beat his wife simply because even in 1975, a woman was deemed a man's property. And they could get away with it. You know, shelters didn't start appearing for battered women until the 60s because literally women were just screaming for help, saying that they could not put up with it anymore. I mean, obviously, as a historian, I'm fairly certain you've heard of the book The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan.
Of course.
Highlighting, you know, all these atrocities with how women were being treated and how they were dissatisfied in their lives. But yet when you think of the 50s and you think of women in the 50s especially,
mm-hmm.
you don't think of that.
No. The other thing is this. The other thing that I think is important, because I'm like you. So, I mean, I went on that whole tangent about Back to the Future. Back to the Future is one of my all-time favorite movies, and
it's a great movie.
And I love it's almost a perfect film. And I mean, it is in my book. It's a perfect film. I think if you want to, I know some film critics have said if you want to teach a class on how to write the perfect screenplay, that you would show them Back to the Future. This is the screenplay by Bob Gale. And the thing about that film is it's very indicative of exactly when it came out, because my opinion is that our nostalgia for the 50s and the way that we view the 50s is actually informed by the 1980s. During the 1980s, you had a real return of nostalgia for the 1950s. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that that the country had gone through 2 decades of social and political upheaval, and with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and a return to sort of more traditional American values at the head of the political system, and somebody who sort of became a political figure in the 1950s with the emergence of his time with General Electric Theater, traveling around the country, and his switch from New Deal liberal to conservative. And the 1950s became hyper stylized in the 1980s. And so our notions of how we think about it are really jaded by the culture of that time. So you had Back to the Future. Billy Joel is another example where Billy Joel in the 1980s, super popular musician, he basically had a 50s period where he put out a bunch of records that sounded like they were in the 50s and the early 60s. You had as I said, you had Back to the Future. You have Reagan as president, and you have a sort of retreat into more traditional values in the social sphere. Sometimes I think our nostalgia for the 50s is more actually influenced by how people view the 50s, the 1980s, than it actually is the 1950s. The other point I wanted to make is the other thing about the 1950s that people don't get is how just fucking radical there was a part of the 1950s. In the 1950s, you had the emergence of bebop jazz. You had the emergence of writers like William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac. And on the completely other end of the spectrum, radical individualists, people like Ayn Rand, writing in the 1950s. Atlas Shrugged was published in 1957. And it was a complete rebuke of the values of sort of sacrifice and duty that were a part of the 1950s culture. So there was a counterculture emerging in the 1950s. Not to mention the fact that the decade gives us the birth of one of the most subversive art forms of all time, which is rock and roll. And you have music which is incredibly primal and sexual in a way that the culture had never had before in that way, with the exception of jazz a generation before. So, when I look at Elvis Presley, a lot of people don't think of that as being radical, but in 1956, he was pretty fucking radical.
Oh, he was extremely radical. I mean, what was it, Dick Van Dyke Show, where he was only filmed from, like, mid-abdomen up?
It was Steve Allen.
Because everything below was just seemed as basically porn.
Yeah.
And they were terrified that these little girls were, like, screaming and crying for him, and yet here he is doing this, like, awkward hip thing, and they deem that as basically porn.
Yeah, because to some it looked like the action of what a man might look like having sex. What I find interesting about that entire thing when he went on the Steve Allen Show was to be funny, they wouldn't film him from the waist up, and the other thing they did was to be a real smartass, because he performed the song Hound Dog. They actually brought a hound dog out on stage. And so, like, he would pet the dog, but then they would cut back to Elvis, and Elvis would do the dancing anyway. So the audience could have seen it. Steve Allen obviously could have seen him do it. And the audience is basically, they're filling in the gaps, right? Like, which I think is so much more subversive than just letting him do it anyway. The idea that we're not going to show him from the waist down and he's going to do it anyway, which means people are going to fill in the gaps. It's the same thing about, a generation later with the sort of parental advisory stickers on the label. The women of the PMRC who pushed putting those stickers on labels, their whole thing was like, well, we need to educate parents about these kids buying these records or whatever. What they didn't realize was the fact that any record that would get a sticker like that automatically got a seal of cool from most of young people. If you got out Motley Crue's Shot at the Devil, or you got out Two Live Crew's record from 1989, with Me So Horny on it, and it had the fucking parental advisory sticker, that would automatically sell more. So It always backfires. Any time that people try to repress things like that, it always tends to backfire.
Well, I think I'm one of those historians that honestly, I kind of in a way support the idea of this cylindrical pattern with history. Mm-hmm. A lot of people term that as, history repeats itself, yada, yada. But you do see it, and you see it with the 80s, you see it with the 50s, wanting to bring back the 50s after that period, those 2 decades of political and social turmoil. And then you're seeing it now after everything that Obama has done, and a certain man in public office who...
Let's call him 45. Or just the president, because he is the president.
Wants to, bring back this nostalgia. Mm-hmm. And, political spheres, political movements, they generally have that cylindrical pattern of wanting to go back and wanting to change things, and then wanting to go back and then wanting to change things. And you see that all through the 1900s, and even sometimes a little bit in the 1800s. I
totally agree. It's a book that really, I think, hits this point home. And if it's not something you've taken a look at, I highly recommend it. Is a book called The Cycles of American History by Arthur Schlesinger, which makes, I think, very much the same point. And it's an excellent book. And he makes an argument that there are periods in time where Americans want more political and economic freedom. And then there are times where they want more government control and they want more social control. And it goes back and forth, back and forth. And it's no surprise that we had a period of history where we elected the first African American president, and then we reelected him. And he became, for all intents and purposes, with a few caveats, one of the most successful and, quite frankly, beloved presidents of modern American history. And it's no surprise that there was a blowback that elected the current president. And the thing that's interesting about him is that he made an emotional argument to people. It wasn't an economic one. I've kept saying, when people were saying about last year's election, oh, it's about economics, it's about the working class. And this,
Absolutely not.
No, this is about culture. Because the thing is that modern American liberals culturally don't have that much cachet with what was historically their political base, which is white working class voters. For decades, white working class voters were solid New Deal Democrats. They voted for Roosevelt, they voted for Truman, and they voted for Kennedy. And they voted for Johnson in 1964. It's after 1964 that changes. With the emergence of the Civil Rights Movement, as you well know, the classic story of Lyndon Johnson, when he signed the Civil Rights Act, said, "I just lost the South for a generation." And he was right. Actually, he was less than right, because it's now been almost 2 generations. The Democrats have not been able to hold on, because as of right now, the only demographics that the Democratic Party appealed to are white collar, middle class to upper middle class voters who are white, and minorities. And that's it, which is why it's tougher for them to be able to win, because they don't have the white working class. Because the white working class may have the same economic position as the black folks who live in their town, who are in the same economic stratum, or the Hispanic Americans who are in their economic demographic where they live, but it doesn't matter because it's a cultural thing. And so the modern American liberal and the modern Democratic Party have not made a strong enough case for why white working class people should vote for them in a way that's culturally salient. But the current president did that. It was all emotions. It was all culture.
Oh, it was definitely all culture. It was definitely all Americans, or all, this motive of emotion. And the thing that really appealed to me as a historian and wanting to learn about what's going on, I know I'm definitely guilty of it. I know you're probably guilty of it, of matching what's going on now with what you study, or, some era in history back and back and back. And the only thing I can keep thinking of, especially with this past election, is how Reagan solidified the middle class for the Republicans.
Yes. So did Nixon.
And so did Nixon, where, they argued for, well, it's your time again. It's your time again to take your country back and have your voice be heard. And I am so sick of, conservatives saying that, oh, this is the first time it's happened. No, it just happened like 30, 40 years ago. Like, I wasn't born then, but chances are I probably were. Just remember. And then it goes back, like I said, to that whole cylindrical patterns where, we had just gotten out of a period of the liberals having a voice and having their chance to make changes. And now we're going right back into the conservatives wanting to go back and make America great again.
Yeah,
apparently.
which of course I think it's very important to note that the phrase "Make America Great Again" became more in vogue with Ronald Reagan. I mean, he was the first person to really use that phrase. One book that I've reflected a lot about, that I've thought a lot about over the last couple of years, is, and I think I mentioned this with Luciano on a previous podcast, is the book Before the Storm, by Rick Perlston, which is all about the Goldwater campaign and the presidential campaign of 1964. And the argument that I make to people is 2016 is what happens if 1964, that if 2016 was what happens that if in 1964 Lyndon Johnson lost and Barry Goldwater won. And because the parallels between the way that Goldwater ran his campaign and the social movement that sort of swept him up to political power in that regard is very, very similar to the president.
Oh yeah, you read transcripts of his speeches that Goldwater gave his entire platform, really, and it's almost eerily word for word of what 45 is saying on his. I refuse.
It's all right.
Of what he was saying on his entire campaign, even what he's saying now is, I mean, I'm not saying that he is plagiarizing or whatever, but like it's eerily similar.
There's a certain, you're right. I think one of the things about Goldwater was a lot of people saw him as being unhinged. I mean, I remember, I think it was either in like the New York Times where there was like a group of psychologists that ran a full page ad in the New York Times basically saying Barry Goldwater is not psychologically fit to run for president, which led to what was eventually became the common sort of campaign norm, what they called the Goldwater Rule, which is that you don't do armchair psychology on candidates. And for a long time, we didn't really do that for the most part. I mean, a lot of people would do that, like with Nixon, that he was paranoid, which was true. With Reagan, it was that he was senile, which was partly true. With W. Bush, that he was kind of an idiot and a puppet, which was slightly true. And the same could have been said about Obama's connections with the sort of the New England liberal elite, which was true. So stereotypes exist for a reason. They're often informed by some sliver of fact, no matter how small it may be. But Goldwater's campaign completely reshaped the Democratic Party. I mean, not the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. And what it did was it took it away from a sort of managerial conservatism of somebody like, say, Dwight Eisenhower, or the front runner in that election, Nelson Rockefeller, who was sort of seen as a patrician, New England, New York, socially liberal, economically liberal Republican. Hell, I like Nelson Rockefeller a lot. And if I was around in 1956, I would have been an Eisenhower Republican. In 1960, I would have been a Rockefeller Republican. That was how liberal he was compared to where the Republican Party is now. And everybody sort of thought that was going to be what would happen. That was the assumed wisdom. Everybody just assumed that Nelson Rockefeller would become the front runner. But he had his own problems. The fact that people didn't like the fact that he was from New York, the fact they thought he was a bit of an elitist, the fact that he had just married a second wife who was half his age and was having his kid. And she was pregnant with their kid before they got married. Like, there's all kinds of stuff about Nelson Rockefeller at the time that was very controversial. That hurt him. And the traditional Republican establishment at the time of people like him, George Romney, who was the governor of Michigan, who's Mitt Romney's dad, the governor of Pennsylvania at the time, all these guys were seen as the frontrunners. But there was a conservative movement that was motivated by the National Review, the Young Americans for Freedom, and all these outside groups that had money that elevated Barry Goldwater. And it was a coup. What happened to the Republican Party in 1964 was a coup. And I think the same thing happened in 2016 with Trump. I think the same thing happened with Trump. It was a social movement that became a political campaign. So anyway, let's go back to sort of talking a little bit about your research. So you were mentioning earlier about the PSAs you've been researching and things like that. Mm-hmm. So you're arguing that you sort of are making some core arguments about the period. I know you're really at the beginning of some of this, so I know some of these ideas may not be as fully formed as you would like them to be. Right. But give us some of the conclusions that you've been drawing from your research.
So first and foremost, at Ball State, we have this amazing program run by this phenomenal professor. and it's basically considered what we call the digital history track. Essentially, instead of writing a thesis like you did, or like many other historians, even this professor has done for years and decades, we are stepping away from the thesis and stepping away from writing the books, and rather finding a way to make history more suitable for a digital age. So you're seeing projects. The Manhattan Project is actually, I just looked at that earlier today. It's online where you can track different aspects of that. But that's first and foremost where I'm going with this. So essentially, this is an entirely new way to look at history. And this has been something that's been in the process since the 90s when internet first, oh, look at this fancy technology. My voices are great.
They're really wonderful. No, I totally agree with you. IPY, where I did my master's, is really a big component, a big part of that too, particularly with their digital humanities professor, Jen Giuliano, who's doing an incredible amount of work over there. And I know of a couple digital projects. So it's definitely moving in that mold.
Yeah, Dr. Seifelt, who's one of my advisors, he is certainly on the ground floor with all of this. And I am honored and amazed that I get to work under him, and it's been a great experience so far. But essentially what my research does, going back to that, is I'm tracking themes actually through forms of popular entertainment, popular culture that was really at the forefront of this decade of the 50s and even going to 45 to 65. I know you kind of briefly looked over a project I did last semester over science fiction movies. Mm-hmm. And essentially, I am carrying those same themes, looking at religion, looking at communism and the bomb and aliens and all these other cool little nifty tidbits about science fiction in the 50s. And not only seeing how they were interpreted by those who lived in the 50s, but also how they carry over into other forms of entertainment. So the industrial propaganda films that you're seeing the government put out during this time. And then eventually, when my thesis, my digital project is put online, it will be just a website of how I've tracked these themes throughout these different modes of entertainment.
That's really cool. And I have a friend of mine, one of my colleagues in the public history program at IPY, his name is Ethan Chitty, who did a very similar project with Ray Bradbury, where he analyzed Ray Bradbury's work in the 1950s as a window to understanding the Cold War. And because I think at the time, a lot of people perceived science fiction as sort of dime store throwaway stuff. But if you really look at who's writing in that period with Ray Bradbury, Robert Heinlein, Harlan Ellison, others, and what they were doing was a lot of subversive social commentary, but the way they did it was through science fiction. Kurt Vonnegut's another example.
Oh yeah. I was just going to say not only what was being written, but what was being highly circulated. I mean, 1950s is where you see the first Hollywood's first take on 1984 by George Orwell, and that was actually one of the films that I talked about in my paper last semester, and especially in regards to religion and politics and communism, actually, the kind of hidden theme of communism throughout that movie.
Yeah, and in particular Stalinism, because you know, in some respects, both Animal Farm and 1984 were a very strong rebuke of Stalinism. Orwell himself did identify as a socialist, but had really become disillusioned with communism during his time fighting in the Spanish Civil War and finding the ways that the Stalinists would turn on their own people. So for the purposes, I guess, of this podcast, let's hone in a little bit about your stuff about religion.
Okay.
And talk a little bit about some of the conclusions you've been drawing about religion.
Well, just keeping with the general theme of what we've been talking about, the importance of religion and Christianity specifically on the American public. And my biggest, with this specific paper, my biggest point with that was War of the Worlds. In the movie War of the Worlds, where the ending scene, the climactic scene where the aliens finally die. And out of nowhere, they just start falling out of the sky and they're dying and crashing into buildings and doing actually more damage than when they were trying to do damage. The main characters, the protagonists of this film, they're standing in a church and everything around them falls except that church. And then all of a sudden it pans out from the church and shows, the destruction around the church. And the voiceover is basically talking about how the aliens were killed with the germs that are found in our atmosphere. And he stresses the importance that, it wasn't the atomic bomb that destroyed them. It wasn't our missiles or our gunpowder, our military, but rather, as he puts it, what God has put on our planet.
That's very interesting.
And he emphasizes that point that, it's ultimately what God gave us that destroyed the aliens rather than what we have created ourselves as humans.
That's so interesting. That there's also a sort of an extended metaphor there about the idea of the heavens have descended upon the aliens and have taken them down, and they fall from the heavens to the earth. And so it's the fall from grace, essentially, for the depraved aliens.
Right. And going off that point in itself is the movie, it's on the tip of my tongue, The Day the Earth Stood Still, which was in the other movies. And when you're first watching this film, you don't see it, but as you keep rewatching and rewatching, like I had to do to write this paper, you see basically the ascend and descend of Jesus through Klaatu, I think is how you pronounce it, where, he dies, and then the robot alien, whose name I can't remember right now, basically heals him, and he comes back to life. And it's seen as this, ascend to descend of Jesus.
Yeah.
And this prevalence of religion.
That's so interesting. I mean, the other component about this, the idea of sort of religious imagery or religious messaging within the context of science fiction. I mean, the first thing that I think of a lot is A Generation Before with Superman. Mm-hmm. Because, Superman, created by two nice Jewish boys from Cleveland, Ohio, Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster. These two guys originally wrote Superman as an evil character, and he was basically like a giant disembodied head who was like evil. Well, that didn't really stick, and so they kind of went back and they rewrote Superman as a hero. And so Superman is, his story is very akin to a lot of the classic religious stories of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So he's born of a faraway land, and he loses his home, and he is basically left as an orphan, and is taken in by two people who are the salt of the earth. So he's very much like Moses, Superman is a Moses character, but then he's also Jesus because he's the savior. And the thing is in the movie that came out a few years ago, Man of Steel, directed by Zack Snyder, who I think himself is a Christian, there's an incredible amount of Christian imagery in that movie.
Oh, yeah.
So from the scene where he's in the church talking to the priest, when it cuts back to Superman and Superman's listening to the priest, there's a big, beautiful stained glass window of Jesus behind Superman. It's not terribly subtle, but it gets the point across. There's another scene where Superman talks to a computerized version of his father, Jor-El, played by Russell Crowe. And he's like, you need to do this, and that, and the other. And Superman's like, okay. And so he floats out of this plane, which has a big hole in it. He's in space. And as he floats out of the plane and then descends to try to fly down, he literally, flies out. His legs are crossed, his arms are out, and his head goes like this. And he looks exactly like Jesus on the cross. There's an incredible amount of Jesus imagery and religious imagery in Superman because he is sort of a modern Christ figure. He's like one part Moses, one part Jesus, one part Uncle Sam.
Yeah, definitely. The big movie, really, it kind of humored me, I guess, because, when you study the 50s, it's obviously one of the pinnacle points in American history of them versus us.
Yeah.
And you have this fight, this ideological fight between American Christians and communist atheists. And essentially that's where, the 1950s is where you start seeing in God we trust, and, having this idea of atheists, apparently we are these horrible stains of the earth. And no movie that I studied, of the 7 movies that I picked, really exemplified this more than Red Planet Mars, which is this early 1950s movie, all black and white. It's a good movie. It's a really good movie. It's a cute movie. I love calling science fiction movies cute. But essentially the whole premise of this movie is that these scientists have created this machine to talk to people in Mars. And these aliens in outer space. But what the aliens, the message they're sending back is the message on the hill. And I know I probably butchered that, and I'll probably hear flack for it, but it's essentially this, they're reading biblical scriptures over and over and over again. And eventually, towards the end, there's a Soviet spy who's trying to destroy the scientist couple's plant and trying to destroy the machine because they're atheists and we're evil. But really, at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, you see, again, that message coming through, but this time the message is saying that I am God. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the entire Soviet Union gets word of this, and the entire Soviet Union economic, political, social structure, everything that is holding it together, collapses. And things are on fire, and people are dying, and but then Christians, they're showing like America, and they're showing Europe, and everybody's like cheering, and it's so profitable, and things are glorious and grand while Soviet Union is burning to the ground.
Yay, genocide. Yeah. Yeah, there's a bit of moral ambiguity there for sure. I think what you were mentioning earlier is when you were talking about the phrase earlier, you said you were worried about getting flack from. It took me a second to figure out where you were going with that, but I think what you were trying, to say, if I understand you correctly, was the concept of the shining city on a hill, the Jonathan Winthrop sermon from the Puritan period.
The sermon on the hill.
Yeah, and or you were thinking of the Sermon on the Mount, which is the New Testament.
That one. Yeah,
okay, so it's the Sermon on the Mount, right on, which is sort of the judge not lest ye be not judged, turn the other cheek,
right.
Things like that. Another thing that I think that's a part of the Sermon on the Mount, certainly in the New Testament, which is easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom, which I always thought was kind of interesting because in the 1950s you see this emergence of Christianity and commerce becoming sort of one thing, and the emergence of what the historian Kevin Kruse calls Christian libertarianism, where Christianity got connected with capitalism and freedom and commerce and this and that and the other. And communism and all of the socialism got associated with atheism and godlessness and heathens and all this and that and the other. I think that's probably a challenge we're going to still face. At least I know in atheism is that there's a generation of people that automatically associate atheism with communism. And that's understandable because communism completely outlawed religion, which is not at all how you deal with the problem of extreme religion.
Right.
And in that respect, Orthodox Marxism was a religion in and of itself, just one without a God. It replaced God with dialectical materialism, which was just as much bullshit as God was. And but it reminds me, you telling me these science fiction stories, it reminds me of one of my all-time favorite Twilight Zone episodes, which has the late, great Burgess Meredith in it, where it's a totalitarian society, very akin to like 1984, where they basically kill people who are obsolete, So if you're like too old, you can't work, you can't do this or can't do that, they basically exterminate you because you're a drag on the society. And so this government agent, a sort of Guy Montag character like in Fahrenheit 451, or a Winston Smith kind of character in 1984, goes to this man's apartment and he finds out it's Burgess Meredith, an old man sitting in a chair. And Burgess Meredith basically, the way that it was set up was they were going to basically kill him because every apartment in this society has like a bomb installed in it, so they just blow you up, which seems very inefficient, but it's very cinematically effective, but it's so much easier just to kill him with lethal injection. But it was the 1950s; they didn't have that yet, or the early 1960s.
Everything went boom in the 1950s.
What?
Everything went boom in the 1950s.
Oh, fucking A, dude, including Elvis's hips. So there's this scene where this agent goes in, and Burgess Meredith, his character is like, I know why you're here, and I know what you're here to do. And basically what Burgess Meredith does was he sort of cons this agent to come into his apartment, and then he locks the door with him, and the door can't be opened back up. And so Burgess Meredith's like, if this is the last moments of my life, it's also going to be the last moments of yours. And sort of makes a point of like, what do you believe in, son? What do you care about? Human freedom? Do you care about the dignity of every human being? And he's like, I don't know. Have you ever read books, son? Have you ever seen this book? And he holds up the Bible. Have you ever seen this book? And the guy's like, no. And so he goes, well, let me read some of it to you. And so he starts reading out of the Bible. And he starts reading some of the passages of the New Testament, the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus and stuff like that. And it makes this man very uncomfortable because you can see he's visibly changing his mind. He's being sort of deprogrammed from the state cult that he's been in. And at the very last moment, he's like, I've had enough. And he literally like runs out the door, and then the bomb goes off and kills the Burgess Meredith character. But he now knows too much. He's been exposed to religion. He's been exposed to ideas. He's been exposed to the concept of freedom. And at the very end, he goes in front of this totalitarian council, and they say to him, thank you for fulfilling your duty, but you are now obsolete. And the guy's like, what are you talking about? I am not obsolete. And the end scene is all these agents just descend on him as if they're going to smother him to death. And he's just screaming, I am not obsolete. I am not obsolete. And it's this like beautiful, beautiful metaphor. I mean, I am a stone cold atheist, but I'll tell you what, that fucking episode moves me to tears. Because the point of it is the idea that the Bible is a whole other thing, but the message of it is a message of human freedom. But it is used in a religious context. I mean, you could have replaced, I don't know, the Bible with like Aristotle or Plato or John Stuart Mill or something like that, or John Locke, the Declaration of Independence. You could have done anything like that.
I mean, you look at modern films, modern movies, and, instantly with you telling me the plot of that, I immediately go and think of The Giver.
Oh, yeah.
And, especially in that book and movie, it wasn't a particular book. It wasn't the Bible, but it was the fact that this little boy could see colors and the amount of freedom that gave him, and how, again, this totalitarian government was like, no, we have to put a stop to this.
Mm-hmm. So in that story, was everybody could only see in black and white, and then?
Yeah.
Okay.
You could only see in black and white, and, you all looked alike, sounded alike. The government chose what you were to do in life.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was one person that was the holder of knowledge.
Oh, that's very cool.
He could see in color.
That's very cool. That's very akin. It reminds me of Anthem by Ayn Rand, which is kind of the same premise. It's a totalitarian society where they don't even have the concept of an I. They don't even have the concept of the individual. So through half of the book, the main character refers to himself as we, because he has no concept of I until he gets to the end. And in this society, they run on all old technology, because that's who the keepers of the society, the gatekeepers, that's what they deem. Well, he finds a light bulb. He either finds a light bulb or he invents a light bulb. I can't remember. But he finds a light bulb, and he tries to show it to the council, like, look at this can change our world, this can make us better, this can help us. And they say, no, It comes from the old world of technology. We do not want it, or whatever. And so he escapes from this society, and he stumbles upon a home that has never been tarnished. And it's from the time before the sort of apocalyptic society that he lived in. And he discovers the concept of I. And then he renames himself. And he renames himself Prometheus, the man who took the fire from the gods. It's you know, and that's the thing about that literature of that period, whether it's 1984, it's whatever Ayn Rand was writing, it's this idea of the individual against the mass. Right. Fahrenheit 451, a lot of what Robert Heinlein was writing, Isaac Asimov was writing, it's all about the individual against the mass. The reason I think there was a big component of that was in the 1950s, everything was collectivistic. There was a certain amount of, there was a high degree of collectivism about the society, and you saw these people who were writing about very individualistic ideas. They were championing individualism, which had been the mainstay of American life for years, and it was subsumed by the managerial liberalism and collectivism of the New Deal through the Great Society. And these authors said, no, we're going to reassert individualism. Now, people could argue that now we live in a society where the pendulum has swung too far to the individualistic side, and we need some forms of common ground and sort of citizenship, which I would agree with. But so there's a lot of things going on at that period where people are really revolting against the sort of the mass nature of everything. I mean, there was a book that came out that you're probably aware of in the 1950s called The Organizational Man. There was one of the most popular novels of the time was one called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, of these ideas of sort of life of middle class, quiet desperation. So the 1960s could not have happened as it did without some of these cultural currents that are bubbling up in the 1950s.
And see, I think, and I look at this a lot with my research, a lot of historians kind of overlook the idea of popular culture and popular entertainment because it was simply that, entertainment. It was just there for people to have a good time, kick back, relax. But really, popular entertainment, literature, film, music, graphic novels, they all showcase not only the delights in our world, but our fears. And you see that with science fiction. There is a New York Times writer who, Anthony Burgess, who wrote this huge article about basically starting with the 1950s, starting with the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the first time, we had seen a point where science fiction no longer predated science fact. And rather, it was science fiction had turned from being, well, this could happen to this is happening. And this is a warning that we need to stop now. You see it with On the Beach, which is a film that came out in 1959. It's another film I looked at where, the ending credit is, there's still time, brothers. There's a banner and there's still time. Popular entertainment, it speaks of history in a way that textbooks cannot. And it emphasizes certain points in our history, certain worries, certain emotions that writing something down, writing a sentence or two down on a piece of paper just can't do that when we're studying history.
I agree. I think the other component to what the study of popular culture is so important is the idea that it is in the name, it's popular. So the ideas of some of the comic books, novels, the science fiction stuff you were describing, the films, the television, these reached massive amounts of people, far more people than some public intellectuals of the period who had their own ideas. I would imagine more people in that period of time, more people saw the man who the day the earth stood still than read Reinhold Niebuhr's thoughts on citizenship and Christianity. I mean, I could almost count on it that more people more people read comic books than read Walter Lippmann. I mean, and there's this overemphasis on just the public intellectuals of the period, and part of that is just because intellectuals love to butter each other up and have sort of a intellectual circle jerk, which the present company is included in that, at least for me, but I do think it's
not a part of that.
is the idea that popular culture and mass media is a way of being just understand where American consciousness is, because it reached so much more people than say the casual reader of a history book or a novel would have been. Or a newspaper. More people read dime store novels than read the New York Review of Books.
I mean, you see that now. I mean, this isn't just a thing where, it happened in the past, past trends or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
After 9/11, I mean, every year, how many war movies or movies about soldiers are you seeing every year coming out? Or even science fiction movies have even delved into, what was it, Battleship LA, where it's basically talking about aliens coming down and basically another World War or War of the Worlds type movie.
Mm-hmm.
And this heightened increase in interest in military films and in these over patriotic movies that you're seeing as a way to bolster. I feel like I'm talking myself in a circle. It's okay.
You're fine. Your point is well taken, that there has been this sort of change that happened where the way in which we sort of perceive the military, there are very few films today about war and about the military that are truly subversive. I think you could probably actually go back a generation before and find more material that was subversive. A film like Apocalypse Now would be very hard to make today. A movie like Full Metal Jacket would be very hard to make today.
Great movie.
An excellent movie. Or if you go even a generation before, if you think of a movie like Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory, which is, I think, one of the most phenomenal anti-war films ever made. Those films would face a lot of an uphill climb because there was a change that happened in the culture. And there's a great book about this by David Sirota about the 1980s, which I've got some of my earlier ideas from tonight, that the U.S. military became more and more involved in the production of Hollywood films. And they had always sort of been involved. I mean, obviously, there was a whole propaganda department during World War II, which is how
Hollywood 10.
Yep, absolutely. Where, Ronald Reagan could claim military service, but in reality, he was just making military PSAs in Burbank. But my point is like, so a film like Top Gun, for example, was a real game changer in the way that the military was filmed in this country. Because after Vietnam, there was something, and you're probably well aware of this, but my listeners might not be, of something called Vietnam Syndrome, where the country felt an incredible amount of anxiety and dread about the military and war and the way we treated soldiers, because many soldiers of Vietnam were treated horribly. They were treated horribly, regardless of whether or not they even wanted to be a part of the war. And most of them had no choice, and most of them were drafted. And with the ascension of Reagan and the ascension of modern conservatism in the 1980s, there was a huge shift where we went from being a country that was sort of racked with anxiety about war and the military and patriotism to being sort of hyper-patriotic. And Top Gun really changed that. So when Tony Scott was making Top Gun, he had an arrangement with the U.S. Defense Department where they would give him planes, they would give him aircraft carriers, they would give him all kinds of shit to film with for free. And in exchange, the Pentagon wanted to see every draft of the script, they wanted to see dailies, and they wanted to see the finished film. They wanted to see every cut of the film they could see. And they made notes, and they made changes. And this is pretty standard practice today. I mean, almost every film that Michael Bay makes that has military stuff in it goes by this procedure. Any movie that you see that has an incredible amount of fighter planes or military equipment or military imagery, chances are it got money from the federal government, and chances are that content that you're seeing is hyper stylized and hyper sanitized for the perception that the military is always good, that soldiers are always the perfect heroes, that the U.S. military can do no wrong, and that they were the perfect beacon of freedom to the world. Now, some of that is true, but a lot of that is not. And it's a caricature that has continued to have an incredible amount of influence in popular culture.
And not only in popular culture, but, as a reflection of, popular culture is the voice of the common people because it's simply popular.
Mm-hmm.
This hyper-patriotism and this conflict, it's not necessarily Vietnam syndrome in the same context, but you're seeing these heightened anxieties now with people. I mean, after last year's election, suicide hotlines blew the fuck up. I mean, I run in my spare time. I'm an admin for a support page on Facebook, and we could not keep up with the amount of people rushing to join the page and speak to admins. I mean, we had to put out notices like we are not public professionals. And you're seeing these same concepts now that you saw back then with Vietnam, and you're seeing it in our popular culture. You're seeing it walking down the street. And which is just another reason as to why studying popular culture, studying literature that's being produced is so important.
No, and I totally agree. I mean, I think that the emergence of this sort of rabid hyper-nationalism and a sort of white identity politics that is sort of pervaded and has become so pervasive within the Republican Party and conservatism has really moved the shift away from the traditional conservatism of old, which was more about sort of the role of government and fighting back against communism or fighting up against fascism or totalitarianism around the globe and being very internationalist, which the Republican Party has been solidly internationalist for generations. Both parties have.
Yeah.
But now you're seeing with the emergence of the alt-right and particularly with, the president's former senior counselor, Steve Bannon, you're seeing this emergence of a politics of white identity and this emergence of hyper-nationalism as a way to alleviate our social and economic ills. Because for a very long time, both sides of the political spectrum have ignored the fact that there are vast amounts of people in this country, many of which who are poor or lower middle class, and they're white, and they're poorly educated, or they're either uneducated or they're undereducated in the sense that most of them don't have a college degree, that don't have a job, that can't keep a job once they get one, that have substance abuse problems. If you look at the counties that suffered the most from the opioid epidemic in this country, the vast majority of them in the 2016 election went for Trump. Mm-hmm. And when an election or two elections before that had gone to Obama. Counties that had gone to Obama twice went for Trump in some of these battleground states.
And you look at Howard County, where, I'm from, at least, they went Trump so quick that it was almost not even a competition.
Nope. The first state to be called in the 2016 presidential election was Indiana, and it was for Trump.
And I mean, this is a county, the city of Kokomo, where, it was 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that Obama came and shook all of these people's hands, my father included. And, after the Chrysler bailout.
Yeah.
And they were so pro-Obama because he had done this. He had helped, bring Kokomo back.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden, here in 2016, boom, everybody is Trump. And you're seeing signs, Trump, make America great again, outside of every door in the city of Kokomo.
That was the thing that I was worried about with the election was you had the political class. The pollsters thought that Clinton would win. The media thought that Clinton would win. The establishment thought that Clinton would win. Wall Street thought that Clinton would win. Almost everybody did. And I did. This whole period has really completely made me evaluate every assumption I ever made about American politics.
Oh, certainly. And not only American politics, but about the people I thought I knew.
Yep. And human
in my
nature.
life.
Yep. And the one moment that I knew that we might be in some deep shit was I was driving home one day from class, and it was still when I was living in Kokomo. And I was coming home from Indianapolis, and instead of just taking the main route of 31, because there was some construction, I took back roads. What? Always.
Construction.
Yep.
31.
I took back roads and went through Tipton.
Mm-hmm.
And I went through Tipton and went through some of the smaller county roads that got me home. And the amount of Trump signs I saw was ridiculous. I mean, I saw so many of them. I saw one house that had a Trump flag. I saw one house that had a Trump mailbox. I saw another house that had 2 Trump Make America Great Again signs taped to the back of the hitch of his pickup truck. I mean, it was huge because, again, Donald Trump struck a cultural nerve. Here is a guy who is a rich, entitled prick from Queens, who has never worked for an honest day in his life, has never earned an honest dollar in his life. This is a motherfucker who's never been around real people ever. He's never had to be. He is an entitled prick.
But yet, I just want to point out the fact that you say that about him. But yet, in his words, it's people like you and I who just want things handed to us.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, I mean, I know you. We're good friends.
Mm-hmm.
We've fought for everything we have.
Yeah. We've both worked very hard. I don't feel like I'm entitled to anything, and I don't expect to be entitled to anything. But the thing about Trump that was appealing to him was the fact that, this is a guy who, this rich prick from Queens that puts gold on fucking everything. Mm-hmm. And yet white working class people who don't have a fucking pot to piss in voted for him. And that's why it's culture. Because even though Hillary Clinton was a woman who came up in a lower middle class home, her dad died when she was young. This is a woman who literally, for the most part, has fought for everything she has. She came from nothing and became the pinnacle of politics. Barack Obama was exactly the same way. Barack Obama was raised by a single mom and his grandparents in Kansas and Hawaii and the Philippines. When he was in college, he tells the story of the first time he ever took Michelle Obama out on a date. She was worried because the passenger side of his car had a giant hole in the floor and you could see the road. This is a guy who literally is the living embodiment of the American dream, who came from nothing and became everything. And yet he's the elitist one. He's the one who's the smug one. He's the one who is the effete, effeminate one. He's the, it's culture. Doesn't matter how many zeros you have behind the number in your bank account. It's culture.
Oh, certainly.
Barack Obama came from a working class background, but acts like an intellectual. Donald Trump may be a rich man, but he acts like fucking white trash. Oh, that's the difference.
You're getting awfully worked up over there.
Well, I mean, and Ta-Nehisi Coates made this same point in The Daily Show, which is like Barack Obama had to literally be the best of us. He had to be the best of us. He had to be a Columbia graduate, a Harvard graduate, the first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review. He had to be a senator. He had to be a state senator. He had to be a community organizer. He had to be he had to be literally one of the greatest people that has ever emerged in American politics in terms of the American meritocracy. And all Trump had to be was rich and white.
And Christian.
That's it. And that's it. And he does. And the thing about him is he is by far one of the most immoral and quite frankly unchristian presidents that has ever been elected. But evangelicals love him. 81% of evangelicals voted for Trump in the 2016 election. That's higher than George W. Bush got in 2004.
And that blows my mind. And the point that I wanted to make is, aside from having this rise of just pure idiocracy that's coming out of this administration, above and beyond anything I know I've ever seen in my lifetime.
Well, we've just had a cabinet resignation this week. We just had one today.
This morning.
Yep. Secretary, Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price resigned over the fact that he took chartered private planes and charged the government $400,000 for it.
Taxpayers.
Yep.
Like, we've gotten to the point where every time that bulletin comes up on our phone, one of us pops out of our room and starts going, oompa, loompa. Because that's basically what this is. It's a giant Willy Wonka factory.
Yep. I can tell you from my study of American politics, this is one of the worst and by far one of the most corrupt presidential administrations in history.
The dangerous part, honestly, for me, as being, not only a liberal, but as being an atheist woman, which, by the way, for your viewers and for you, that is the first time I've ever said that publicly. So, round of applause.
Congratulations. Congratulations. We have a Reason Revolution exclusive. It's pretty cool.
But it's this notion that if you don't agree with me, you are a vile, immoral human being.
Yes.
And that's this culture that's coming out of this political sphere. And that's what's blowing my mind about these people I thought I knew in my life. My family, like I said in the beginning of all of this, my parents, they raised me to be so secular and to treat people equally and to treat people essentially how I would want to be treated. The old golden rule of be kind to your neighbors, do unto others. But it's the same core group of people that ended up supporting Trump, and they're throwing, to use generics, modern slang, they're throwing shade left and right at all these different types of people, women, Muslims, people who basically don't fit the stereotypical white middle-class Christian family. And it's scaring me, not only as what is our country coming to, but, I don't feel comfortable anymore saying that we are one nation indivisible. And I texted this to my dad, actually, after this whole weekend with the NFL blow up about, take the knee, where I flat out told my dad, we used to be one nation indivisible, where we came together as brothers, as sisters, as, a culture that did not let stereotypes define us and did not let differences define us and separate us. And it's about damn time that we fucking start acting like that again.
I totally agree. And I recently just listened to a conversation that Sam Harris had with an author by the name of Mark Lilla, who wrote a book about this very problem called The Once and Future Liberal, where he makes a very strong criticism of identity politics. I'm with Sam Harris on this one, and I think I mentioned this in a couple episodes ago when I sort of threw my hat in the ring as being a part of the new center, is this idea that we're seeing both sides of the political spectrum become obsessed with a politics of identity rather than a politics of ideas. Where generations before, there was a politics of identity that said, we are African Americans, and we are standing together and uniting together to fight for the equal treatment under the law and to be a part of the American contract. Women did the same thing, and the LGBT community has recently done the same. But the problem that we're running into now is that has been warped from being about, we're going to create a social movement that ensures that we have political and social equality, to I'm going to define every single issue ever by my race or my sexual orientation or my gender identity. And the problem with that is that democracies work best when we work under shared norms and values. The problem with the splintering that's going on with this identity politics is that because everybody is so fragmented and obsessed with what they are, they're not obsessed with what they actually want. And that's really the problem. So, yes, I think what's going on with the people with Trump is terrible, but I'm almost equally bothered by the sort of, these entitled college kids on college campuses who are the most privileged and wealthy generation in history, are are shouting down speakers they don't agree with, violently assaulting professors for being associated with speakers they don't agree with what happened to Charles Murray at Middlebury College this year, what happened to Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State. This is a huge problem for the left as well, where, you know, if your only argument for being against someone falls down to just calling them a racist or a sexist or a bigot without actually having any evidence as to whether or not they actually are, that's not constructive. You know?
Not only is it not constructive, but you really need to pick up a dictionary and read what these words actually mean.
Mm-hmm.
And so last week I talked to you briefly, going along the same lines of how I sat in on a talk by Angela Davis,
mm-hmm.
which, by the way, was probably one of the best hour of my life.
Nice.
Because I just got to share a room with Angela Davis. And for your listeners who might not know who she is, you know, in the 1970s, she was a huge political activist as far as gender rights and race rights, and wanting to abolish the prison system and change the prison system, how we do it.
Was she a part of the Black Panthers?
I want to say she was.
I can't remember if she was or not, but yeah.
I want to. I'm not sure. So don't quote me on that.
Okay.
But she brought up an interesting point during the question and answer. I actually, one of the reasons why I didn't get my book signed like I had told you I was going to. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Stuff happens.
But we got to sit in on the question and answer portion of her talk, and one of the kids, you know, brought up, well, wouldn't it be great if everybody just kind of all agreed on this? And she flat out shook her head and said, no, I don't want you to agree with me. And I agree with her on that. I don't want people to agree with me, because that's not how we get things done. That's not, nope. We don't want a cookie cutter society. We want people who have debate rather than argue. Mm-hmm. And that's how, historically speaking, that's how we've gotten things done in America. And this whole polar opposites of how everything is so splintered and so divided. And so, well, what about me? What about me? What about me?
The other component to it, too, is this sort of acceptance of violence as a means for achieving your goals. So, you know, I've caught a lot of flack from people for saying that I don't think it's okay to punch people simply by virtue of them disagreeing with you. Yeah. So, for example, I cannot be in any more firm agreement that Nazis are horrible, that fascism is horrible, that calling for the genocide of another race is horrible. These are disgusting and awful views that should be delegitimized, deplatformed, and removed from public discourse. Having said that, I have a huge problem with the idea that vigilantes are going to go out and just punch people that they don't agree with. Because here's the thing. While it may be ethically sound to punch a Nazi, where you might feel okay with it, you know, what happens if we say, you know, Nazis could turn that back on everybody else and say, well, you know, I don't like black people, so I'm going to punch black people because I don't, you know, because I find them abhorrent. Or somebody who says, I don't like atheists. I think atheists are horrible, so I'm going to punch them too. This is a huge problem. Now, that's not to say that people should not defend themselves if they're being harmed by violence. So, for example, I know of a lot of activists when Charlottesville was going on who fought back against the Nazis because the Nazis physically harmed them. That's a completely different situation. If someone is physically harming you, then you have more than a right to defend yourself with physical violence. That is not the whole issue. But to simply punch people because of beliefs is just, I think, really a problem, because the issue here is we either have discourse or we have violence. That's all we've got. And so if we don't resolve this with communication, then all we have left is violence. and then we have a society that descends into barbarism. And that's really where I'm worried. The other thing is that when you punch these people, you make them martyrs to their movement. You actually make them stronger. That's like the other problem, right? So like everybody in the liberal echo chamber, like, yeah, you pop Richard Spencer in the mouth, like good for you. And I'm not gonna lie, seeing Richard Spencer get popped in the mouth was kind of cool. I mean, because fuck that guy. But at the same time, I do think that it's problematic to punch people simply because you don't agree with them. Although, if there was anybody who deserved a punch in the face, it's probably him. But, it's...
I like to name a few.
There are definitely a lot of people. I would have loved to have popped Nigel Farage in the mouth when the whole Brexit thing was going on. The lying son of a bitch. About,
right.
We're going to get out of the EU to save the NHS money. Next day after exit. So you're going to get all that money for NHS? I don't know. Well, you're a lying motherfucker then. So anyway, that's kind of the big issue here. Well, this has certainly been a very interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, Kelsey. You're a great friend, and this has been a really great interview. Thank you for joining me tonight on this episode.
Thank you.
Is there any way people can reach you if they want to learn more about what you're doing?
So I just set up my own website, actually, that will pretty much going forward into the end of my master's program. They can kind of keep monitoring. Right now it's still fairly new, so I don't have anything up there. But it is kelseygordon.com, KelseyGordon.com, no spaces, no caps. As well, if you have any questions, you can always email me at Kelsey and Gordon, and as in nose, spelled the same way, 94@gmail.com. Keep looking back if you're interested in what I do.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been a real blast, and I will talk to you soon.
Definitely.
Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that was my conversation with Kelsey Gordon. That's it for this week's episode of Reason Revolution. Please subscribe to us on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. If there's a platform you listen to podcasts on that I'm not on, please let me know and I'll try to make it happen. Send us your feedback at reasonrevolutionpodcast@gmail.com. Also follow our Facebook page at facebook.com/reasonrevolution. As always, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at The Daily Clark. And until next week, this has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.